All right. Dr. Chris, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really happy to have you on the podcast. I think we're going to have a super exciting conversation today. How are you doing?
Great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. So I filled in my listeners a little bit in the introduction of this episode about your background, just a little basic information, but I would love if you could share with all of us anything that you feel is interesting or relevant. Maybe tell us just a little about yourself and how you got into your line of work.
Yeah. My name's Chris Bantock. I'm owner of Colorado Center for Functional Medicine, and I help people try to figure out and reduce chronic diseases. So that's kind of the premise of a lot of functional medicine is you focus a lot on lifestyle and nutritional factors, and while getting down to the root causes of their illness, right? Because you have probably what frustrates me the most is you see urgent cares, new hospitals being built all the time, so many different clinics. And it's just kind of this constant revolving door as opposed to trying to develop that patient into being their own doctor. And how can they potentially, just keep their health and maintain their health right now? Because even right now during a pandemic, we're kind of realizing, yes, medicine is awesome at dealing with acute care, but when we don't have answers, right? And we are looking at people who are chronically inflamed and obese, and those are the ones that are kind of being most hurt by this. So we kind of sit back and we was like, okay, how do we potentially save people from a system that doesn't value necessarily prevention and wellness? And how do we emphasize nutrition and lifestyle modifications, which, 2/3, 3/4 of our diseases that we have in our country are rooted in that, yet few people are talking about it. Few people are talking about it because, again, we value a revolving door as opposed to value results in a practice. So, 10, 15-minute office visits, prescribe, see you later, I'll see you in 3 months, 6 months is not really changing lives. So that's kind of like one of our big mission here is how do we create patients to become their own doctor, have their own wellness, be their own wellness advocate, and really stay out of offices.
That's amazing. My journey into this whole sustainability realm started with my own personal health, actually. So looking into my health and wanting to feel better and make some pretty big changes, it started with my own diet and just choices of what I put into my body and surround my body with. And then that kind of just naturally led into a curiosity that opened up this whole realm of sustainable living, and all these factors continued to connect with each other. And even within this podcast so far, you are now the fifth interview of starting this podcast series, and we've been talking about how sustainable living connects to not only taking care of the planet, but also your financial well-being, your mental health state, and your connection to bigger social issues. And then finally, now I'm so excited to talk to you about physical health and wellness. And so I'm super excited that you and your team are working with people to give them the tools that they need to, become their own doctor, like you said, and to care for their bodies. You work with the Colorado Center for Functional Medicine, right?
Mhm.
Great. And this is
Right.
your own practice?
Yes. Yep. Where we
Awesome.
have a couple of wellness coaches as well. So they're kind of the machines for the practice because they're the ones who are carrying out certain specific food plans that I'll kind of prescribe, and they'll talk about the lifestyle modifications. Where's the exercise come in? Where's your stress management? How is your sleep? All these things that I can talk about a lot in a visit, but it's sometimes beneficial to sometimes have a coach potentially just focus on those things, and they can talk to the person a lot more frequent. So, because we kind of always ask, what defines a healthy person? Like, how do you define a healthy person? And somebody will say, oh, well, I don't take any medications, right? It's like, or I don't have any symptoms. But instead, health is something that you have to work at continually every single day. And that is, do you exercise? How is your food? How's your stress management? How are your relationships? How's your interaction with your community? So how is your sleep? Like, that's what defines a healthy person to us in true wellness. And that's what's going to keep diseases away. So yeah.
I love that. That is so great. And could you share, before we move on real quick, could you share just maybe a couple examples of, like, what does your typical day look like? What do you tend to do when you're working with your patients that come in, or what kinds of, plans are you walking them through? Could you share a few examples of that?
Yeah. So a couple of things, like some of the people who are seeking out functional medicine many times have 10 to 12 different diagnoses. They're on multiple different medications, and they're sick and tired of being sick and tired. So whenever I do a consult with someone, even meeting them for the first time, it's an hour-long visit. And it's really, I do a lot of listening. I try to not interrupt too many times at all and just let that person talk, because it's amazing how many times, if you can go back 20 or 30 years when they've been that sick, you're like, all right, I think we potentially have figured out where we need to go as far as testing. Now let's test and then see where we can go from there. And then we pretty much right away start people on certain food plans too. So we kind of have a foundational food plan, elimination detox diet that everyone pretty much goes on, and it eliminates a lot of the most common inflammatory foods. We do this with every new patient. We even do one at the beginning of the year, starting like, I think next week, on where we do it as a community and we do it as a group, because it's kind of a tough thing when you eliminate so many different foods. But we lay out great menus and delicious recipes to make that easy. And it's me and my wellness coaches on the call. So that's just a part of what we do as far as food plans. And then we do a lot of testing with people. I review a lot of labs and talk about their lifestyle and prescribe, different types of nutritional supplements or lifestyle or behavioral factors to help enhance their laboratory work. So it's just a different way of, rather than using, medications to potentially correct labs or help somebody or treat somebody, you're using just lifestyle, nutrition, and supplementation to help restore the body. And then you're retesting, making adjustments, things like that. So it's a lot of talking to people more so. We're not necessarily, I say it's like, I'm not the fanciest office out there. I don't have all this fancy equipment. It's simply a brain and you, and the person is really the facilitator of everything. So I'm kind of like, I don't get anybody better. It's usually always the patients that get people themselves better.
That is so amazing. I love that approach. And that definitely sounds really different than any personal experience I've had with a doctor so far. I don't think I could pick out one instance where a doctor actually sat down with me for an hour and listened to my history and my concerns and really took that much time and attention to detail. So I'm sure that your patients are really benefiting from that. And I'm just excited that you're out there doing that work.
Yeah, thanks. It's fun.
So let's dive into our topic. I know that this is, and we talked about this in preparation for this podcast episode, but this is a really broad topic. So I'll just say that right from the get-go, that talking about the connections between living sustainably and your own physical health are so vast, and we could go in a million directions with that. But in these first few, introductory episodes to the podcast, I just kind of want to zoom out and get this big picture view of what a well-rounded approach to sustainable living looks like. So, for example, many of us have started to make more eco-friendly choices in our daily lifestyle based on how we want to take care of the planet. And that looks different for all sorts of people. But I would love if you could just share from your own perspective with our listeners, like, how could some of these sustainable choices have positive impacts on their physical health? A really clear example that comes to my mind right away is like all the plastic debris that is floating within our waterways and therefore polluting our water systems. And then we end up drinking that water. That can't be good for us. So I wonder if you have a few examples that you could just share about the whole physical health impact of this.
Yeah, exactly. There are, when you think about inflammation, all right, and inflammation is kind of a buzzword right now, but it's how your immune system reacts. And your immune system is going to react to self or non-self. And primarily, you do not want it to react to self. You want it to react to things that it's not used to seeing, right? That's your bacteria, your viruses, your parasites, things like that. But then also you have to think about it from a toxic standpoint too. So your phthalates, which come from plastics, right? Your BPA comes from plastics. So these plastics are completely synthetic made. Our immune system's not seeing that. It creates a lot of inflammation as that component. So I think plastics are, we use, I think in the United States, more plastic than any other country, right? And so drinking that water bottle, or you just, sometimes you go to the store and people are just, 24 pack of case of water, like all the time. And then maybe they'll leave it in their car. And then they don't think about that, but that plastic is leaching into that water. Now you're consuming it. Well, who cares, right? It's just water. I don't feel it right away. And that's some of the biggest issues I would say with some chronicity, or especially with toxins, is you don't feel acute toxicity of BPA, or you don't feel acute toxicity of phthalates or 2,4-D or glyphosate or those types of things. You don't feel it. So instead, it just kind of continues to build up this toxic burden inside of your body. And next thing you know, oh, I've developed a thyroid issue, or now, it's hard for me to get pregnant, or I'm having breakthrough bleeding, or you're having just these other, and that's primarily what these are really big endocrine disruptors. So your endocrine system is your hormone system, and that these chemicals will bind. They might mimic estrogen. They might block estrogen's effects. They might block productions of testosterone also. So it does affect your endocrine system. And of course, so again, that's where you're talking about our environment and having those plastics do that. But then you can also extend this even further to, clothing, to mattresses, to your couch, to the plastics in your carpet, right? Because a lot of that's, over the backing of that carpet that you're walking on. I mean, things are, if you're thinking like, hey, that's not natural, then it's definitely probably more synthetic, and your immune system is going to react to it. And you have to think about everything that you don't pee out, poop out, or sweat out. If I can say poop on here, just did, then it stays in you. Right? Everything that you touch and put on your body and breathe in, and if you're not doing, peeing, pooping, or sweating that out, it stays inside of you. And where does it go? Well, lead might be more stored in your bones, and that's going to affect osteoporosis, right? But you don't see that until you're 65, 70 years old, and you realize, oh, well, I go to the gun range actually every day, or I'm a reloader, or I do all these types of things from that, right? Or we're dealing with, the great water crisis in Flint, Michigan, which I'm sure you're familiar with, right?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. And that's coming in. And that's even in Denver, Colorado right now, too. But it's mostly with the pipes leading from the main pipes into people's houses. And that's why, what do they get? They have a activated carbon filter, and it just takes out the lead. But that's how long of that was ensuing, right? And some people, and that's the difference of acute toxicity, right? The diarrhea, the headaches, the vomiting, those types of things from there versus chronic, or just this slow bioaccumulation. I hope I'm answering your questions.
No, you totally are. And of course, while you're answering these questions, a million more are coming into my head, because I think a lot of listeners might be thinking what I'm thinking, which is, how do we possibly avoid all of these plastics, and not even just plastics, but synthetic materials? Like you talked about, it's everywhere. It's in our couches, our carpets, our clothes. So I don't know. What's your professional opinion on how to take care of our bodies to the best that we can? Because obviously we cannot avoid all of this entirely, or if we can, I don't know how to do so. I haven't learned that yet.
Right. I mean, those are some big things too, but I would say, it kind of comes down as simple as, buy a water bottle and refill it with your carbon filter, or, reverse osmosis can actually utilize a lot of water, but sometimes I will really recommend that depending on people's water. Because I guess, Katie, have you ever tested your water?
No, not personally.
Your tap water? You drink your tap water?
Right. I filter it, but I do drink it.
And we're pretty lucky here to have great water, but there's a lot of chemicals and plastics and pharmaceuticals found in our water supply, but it doesn't matter, right? Because it's in such small amounts. But it's like, well, for me, I'm like, well, I don't really want even that small amount that's going to accumulate, especially if we can't account for it. So, but that's sometimes as simple as you can't avoid a lot of things, but you can think like, oh, well, this is plastic Tupperware that I'm going to utilize, right? And I hope everybody doesn't microwave plastic Tupperware, right? And getting glass Tupperware is such a more effective thing. It's easily reusable going into there, and you can eat your food right out of it. You're not going to deal with the leaching of any of those plastics into there. So you just kind of tell yourself, oh, I'm just saving my hormones if I'm going to have this plastic Tupperware. I mean, those are those simple things that just observing like how much plastic you're utilizing every day and how can you get it out? Because there's a lot of course, plastic is easy sometimes. Oh, it's completely sterile, right? I don't have to worry about getting infected. You look at hospitals, right? And they're using this stuff up like crazy everywhere. But that's just, there's lots of those ways of what you would be thinking about. Even plastic forks, we bought, I don't know what we were doing. We might've been camping or something like that. And it might've been easier to have a plastic fork. in that, but we bought compostable plastic forks, right? Well, in this fine print on there, because we compost, and on the fine print, it said, not suitable for home composting, only suitable
Right.
for commercial composting. It was like, because it'll take forever for it to break down in other areas, because, probably because home composting doesn't get hot enough, I would imagine. But there are other areas of just trying to avoid, just those simple ways of plastic. And even maybe after this podcast, people will kind of see, I mean, we have 200,000 plus chemicals out there. You can't avoid it, but there's other things you could do. A lot of these things are water soluble, so they get out that way, or they're rooted through glutathione or phase 1, phase 2 detoxes in the liver. So enhancing levels of glutathione is very, very important. So glutathione is the most potent antioxidant that you have in your body, and it's there to neutralize and detoxify many different things, from hormones to metals to these types of toxins and plastics to herbicides and pesticides. So simple ways of just increasing that are kind of, green tea daily. So I'm a proponent more of decaffeinated drinks. So yeah, some decaffeinated tea, even matcha, but I know matcha is going to have some caffeine in that too, but that will help increase glutathione level. And I would say, really purified water is important. I mean, really good, clean drinking water is not, it's harder and harder to come by, and we have different things, and you can have, you can actually request from your drinking water board, like their tests, right? They need to be doing quarterly tests. You can see what is actually in our water. We have EPA standards, and then you have other types of standards, right? So for me, I want to have the cleanest water that's there, but the EPA might be like, oh, that's good enough to not make people sick. And that's important, right? Because there's a difference of, we don't want people getting sick, but at the same time, how can we actually have true wellness, or true, clean, pure water? Because that's going to be important from detoxification, because they're all water soluble, right? So, or many of these toxins are water soluble. So testing your water is important, and you'll look at National Science Foundation or Environmental Working Group. I'm sure have you ever heard of them, Katie?
I have, yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. So, but they have their tap water database. Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm actually not.
Okay, so the tap water database, they basically just, bring all these, you put in your zip code, and they bring all the different water boards in, and they're testing and say, oh, this is where they failed EPA standards. This is when it was approved. I mean, my mom lives in a small town in Kansas, and she can't even use her well anymore. It's actually a Superfund site because of all the herbicides that's being used in nitrogen and benzene, all these things that are in it. So she can't even use her well to turn on her spigot. So now she's in city water. What was interesting, because in multiple quarters, it was failing their water. So the water tests were failing, but all the time they just, it's not enough to make people sick. Yeah, we're going to keep working on it. Right? They might get a slap on the wrist, slap on the wrist, slap on the wrist, and then they finally come into compliance with EPA standards. But no one really knows that unless you look that up. But here we are drinking this potentially toxic water that's not passing these standards, that's not making you acutely sick. It's just maybe something, and I don't have evidence for this at all, but it's like, who knows, maybe at 75, it's Parkinson's or dementia that comes around. We don't have causes for that. But again, we know that they're affecting mitochondrial function. We know they affect cell responses and inflammation. And those are big areas where so much disease is rooted in.
Wow. So it sounds like it's really boiling down to assessing where you are and trying to find the balance between what you can control and what you can't. I mean, even with the example with plastic water bottles, and I think about Flint, Michigan, and I think about all these people who, if they can't drink the water coming from their very own taps, then there are a lot of people that are reliant on plastic water bottles or, huge jugs of water that are being brought in for safe drinking water. And that's what they need to rely on a lot of the time right now, but it's also not the end all solution. It's definitely not better in the sense of like not poisoning them at all, because there's still all these plastics and chemicals that are leaching into the water. But it's an ongoing process to fix the root of the water issues.
Mhm.
And then in our own lives here in Denver, Colorado, or even particularly in my neighborhood, I know that I don't have to worry about that as much, but I'm definitely not going to be buying these disposable plastic water bottles just for my own health, and then also for the sense of not wanting to dispose of something, every single day when I could just take my own water bottle and refill it all the time. But I think what's interesting is thinking about this balance of reusing and repurposing something, but also to what end? Like the plastic Tupperware example, I feel so seen and so like, I need to fix this because I have a bunch of plastic Tupperware that I haven't wanted to get rid of just for the sake of like, I don't want to get rid of this. It's a usable material. However, I could easily repurpose that for things that are not food related. I could use it for storage containers. I definitely don't need to be microwaving with it. And I also have my glassware that is perfectly capable of storing and microwaving my food and all that. So I think it sounds like what you're boiling it down to is really just looking at where you're at and what kind of balance you can control.
Mhm. Yeah. And again, and really, and this is what we tell people all the time, like, this is something that, I continue to gain knowledge on. Like, I'm not an environmental toxicologist by any means, but as you gain more of this knowledge, you just have to ask, is that normal? Is that something that my ancestors had 200 years ago, right? Because we are dying earlier now, even in our generation. So no, they didn't have that. So that wouldn't make much sense, right? Or is this how a caveman would eat? Like, you kind of go back to these foundational things. If I can't picture where it came from, then potentially we should question that. Is this well for me? And at the same time, it's like, we won't find out about things for 30, 40, or 50 years after it's been on the market. I mean, look at what was just happening with glyphosate. So glyphosate is, primarily the main herbicide in Roundup. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, right?
But I
Okay.
would love if you explained for anyone who doesn't know.
It's just, if you'll see it. So this is Roundup. So if you go to the Home Depot, right, or Lowe's or anything like that, you smell it. I mean, you can smell 2,4-D in there too, but that is, we just found out that that's right causing lymphoma for people. And now you have these lawsuits and all these things that you can see on the television from that. One, it's still being sold, right? We
Oh my
still see it out
gosh.
there. We know it's causing cancer
Yeah.
now, but that's just another component of this toxin, right? It's like, now you put that in the bigger scheme of things. Well, this helps with a lot of our growing of our food, right? Well, because how do you feed 7 billion people, right? In this world, like, that is that's a really fundamental question when we talk about monocropping and other ways of that being, which could be a whole different topic too of conversation. One thing too about the plastic bottles, right? Because I do want to, I think a lot of us, and you can be completely combative and corrective to me too, that would be great. But many of us are like, well, it's okay because I recycle those, right? But where do we actually send all of these recycled bottles?
Oh, are you asking me?
The Philippines, right? I mean, at least
Yeah.
that's from my understanding, right? But most of this goes to the Philippines and it becomes somebody else's problem. And we literally, so we take this recycling, or it's either incinerated or we just end up throwing it in the trash, right? There's a little bit more, I feel more controversy that's come out with this recycling, that we're not really using it and repurposing it like we are really supposed to be, or at least that's what we're told. I mean, it's like, I don't live in Denver where everyone, I think, gets recycling. I pay extra for the recycling. I don't know if I'm doing it because it makes me feel better, or it's just easier for the cardboard because that stuff's more easily recycled. But here we are with this plastic bottle that uses oil and these fossil fuels to make. Then we put it on a ship, which uses a ton more oil and fossil fuels to send it back all there. And it's like, how sustainable are those types of things, even when recycling it? And that's really the only difference is, are we really doing just by that, or do we really need to get beyond the thinking of these plastics, I guess?
Exactly. It takes an entire shifting of perspective, and not just at an individual level, but definitely at a global level. And there are multiple countries that won't accept our recycling anymore, from the United States. Like, we are notoriously so bad at recycling. There's just a lack of education out there, for one, but a lot of our recycling ends up getting contaminated, and it's just being sent off, like you said, to other countries as if it's not our problem. And then it becomes their problem. And then it's polluting their countries. And I think about the fact that climate change, well, actually, the World Health Organization had an article recently that talked about how climate change is the number one health crisis facing humanity today, in their opinion. And a lot of what they were talking about was that there are so many countries and people around the world that are doing the least amount that contributes to climate change, and yet they're receiving the most of the brunt of these um, negative results. For example, with water pollution and air pollution. And a lot of that does come with us shipping our stuff overseas, treating other countries like trash, really. And then all of a sudden, their waterways and air quality is being totally polluted. So, yeah, this is a very deeply rooted and deeply connected topic that spans across a lot of subjects.
Yeah. One thing too, and we kind of look at what's not a big deal, right? Because we're humans and it hasn't really affected us that we see from a health perspective. But you still look at like the the canary in the coal mine, like how is this affecting the frogs? How is this affecting the other amphibians that are out there? I mean, these chemicals are truly affecting them and their young too. And again, they're just the smaller aspects of it. It really is affecting us too. We can't deny that we are separate from this world. We are living with this world or on it or anything you want to, however you want to. We're not, it's not just here to serve us, So, and living with it is a much better way in understanding how do we just protect it. And that can go back to even, water. I mean, again, it goes back to water. I always think like, I really just want clean food, clean air, clean water. And that's all.
Is that a lot to ask for?
That's a lot to ask for, I guess, right? And again, I think, is it 4 million deaths a year are potentially associated with just pollution alone, because that's influencing cardiovascular disease, respiratory, cancer, stroke, those types of things. Again, just from pollution. So having clean air, I guess it's a lot to ask.
It seems like it should be such a simple ask, but it's really not. And I wonder, are there some maybe personal examples within your own life of choices that you make that you are really conscious of? This is benefiting your physical health, but it's also better for, the planet or our air quality or whatever the bigger picture is. I mean, you clearly, I would assume, don't use Roundup, and you you refill your own water bottle, but do you have some examples of what else you do?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess a couple of things, I don't know if you have an air purifier, that's always something to have around, a HEPA air purifier, which can sometimes go down to 0.1 microns, because again, that's just the air that you breathe. So, and where is that supposed to go? I mean, that clean air, that's your oxygen being brought in. There's a lot of particulate matter in that air too. So an air purifier is another simple way, and only maybe use it in your main room. No, we're not going to purify all of the air out there, but we think about, and I might have mentioned this, I think we want to blame a lot on carbon emissions of vehicles and automobiles out there, but instead, do we really need to have our temperature gauge at 71 degrees, or can we have it at 69 or 68 degrees and put on a sweatshirt just to help reduce, the energizing in the buildings? It's amazing that, I guess I'll kind of pick on California a little bit because I remember living there for a brief time, but
So did I.
You walk around and, they're air conditioning everything and their doors are completely open. And it's like, what are we doing here? And then you look at the laws that they're being passed and it's all like, I don't know if it's lipstick on a pig to make them feel better that they're doing things about the climate, but like, those are some pretty foundational things that we should be doing as far as reducing of energy goes.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder, I'm also thinking through just different, places that people might be tuning in from, their level of accessibility. What do you think about, I don't know if you know much about this, but what do you think about having, house plants within different rooms of your house as an air purifier naturally, if people can't afford to buy like,
Yeah,
yeah.
Exactly. I mean, there's a couple of, the spider plants, the philodendrons, peace lilies, those are kind of your bigger ones. One, why not, right? It's pretty to look at. It's part of nature. We know nature can just help drop cortisol levels anyways. I think it's wonderful. I read some things that it could be as upward as 100 plants to potentially that you would need to help in that equivalent of an air purifier. But more, I mean, why not when it comes to that? And it should just be another thing you think about. just when you plant the plant, of course, you're being closer to nature in that you're digging in the soil. So that's another benefit too by just planting it. But that's about my extent of that knowledge. What
No,
other plants what other plants would be really beneficial for that?
I've heard that snake plants are really great air purifiers. I don't know if you already mentioned that one, the
Okay.
spider plant, snake plant.
Mhm.
But yeah, I would have to do some more research into the actual statistics of like how many this could take to really equal a standard air purifier. But
Mhm.
like you said, it really can't hurt. You're surrounding yourself with a little bit more nature and being that more connected to it. And then it does purify the air. I think about, you talked about earlier, you were mentioning something about, I think, air pollution and air quality, and then also, people who are being affected by, I think you said heat stroke or something, but I know we've also talked in the past about the urban island heat effects and how there are all these cities around the world that are not only getting increasingly warmer due to global warming, but on top of that, due to the fact that there's just no greenery, they're this very, very urban concrete setting that just reverberates heat off itself. I'm not sure if that's quite the right phrase, but
Yeah.
then all the people living there are a lot more susceptible to heat stroke and heat exhaustion and all those other health effects that come with this. So I don't know if there was something that maybe you wanted to expand on or could expand on with that.
Yeah, going back to that too, and then kind of going back to air quality and pollution, right? Because here in the last 2 years, or it's just been, or even maybe the last 5 years, right? It's been rough with the wildfires, right? We weren't on fire last year, but the West Coast sure was on fire, and we sure did take the brunt of that. You could even see the particulates there. That's really big when you're talking about some of the, the dioxin, that's a chemical that's just burning in those forest fires. That is, we know that these, as climate change starts to, as it just continues on, we're going to have these more extreme weather changes happen. And breathing in that chemical matter is only going to increase cardiovascular disease. It'll increase rates of cancer. It will increase rates of respiratory diseases too. I mean, but we're seeing that, of course, as a fire, and that's not even affecting us, right? That's 1,600 miles away or 2,000 miles away, however far. So, and that's coming here to affect us. We're only going to continue on with that. And, everyone's been masking up, and that's probably a decent reason to mask also in that, because of just breathing in that particulate matter. And that's only going to continue to increase probably with climate change, which is directly affecting the air you breathe. Hold your breath for 60 seconds and tell me that air is not crucial for you, and what's going to go in there. So that's quite important. And, making just another easy assessment, they talk about, changing out your furnace filter, closing your windows, all these types of things too. Well, keep in mind, we breathe through our nose. So sinus rinsing and doing a saline rinse is pretty simple when getting some of those toxins out. So it's not just sitting in our nasal membranes. That's another simple way to do. You can make your own saline wash with distilled water and use your own neti pot or squeeze bottle and just push it up and get those toxins out of there also. As far as pushing on the urban heat island, right, where you have the, just over time or each day, the sun's shining on concrete and asphalt, that's absorbing a lot of heat, and then nighttime comes around and it releases a lot of that heat too. We know that there's potential for decreases in precipitation in cities because of that, and it might be a little bit more in surrounding areas where you're going to have an increase in precipitation. But yeah, there is an increase in or there's a potential more for increase of heat stroke among the elderly, right, which are more people who are going to be more susceptible to that. Or yeah, just those other heat related illnesses with that heat island. There is a time, I think I read this might have been 15 years ago, so who knows how much of it's changed, but Los Angeles has so much concrete that it can't even absorb water anymore, because they've just constantly put down all of this man-made matter.
Wow. I haven't heard that, but I definitely want to look into it. It certainly sounds believable, and again, that goes back to what we talked about earlier, where there are all these aspects that we cannot control. As individuals, we can't always control where we live and what, our infrastructure is like around us. But as a whole, we can all be doing a lot more to think about this bigger picture. And then, our voices do matter when we vote. And then when we vote with our dollars, with the things that we decide to purchase, that all really influences the grand scheme of things as well. I think about even in my own kitchen, I've been trying to learn more about toxins. And honestly, that's not something that I'm super well versed in at the moment, but I am trying to learn a lot more about it. And I just switched out my cookware because I had all of this like Teflon coated, very toxic cookware that was non-stick. And that's what had sold me on it when I first got it like 8 years ago. But all of a sudden I was talking with a friend and learning more about how awful this was, and the fact that it was so old that all of that Teflon was starting to like chip away while I was cooking. That's really what brought up the conversation between her and I, because I was like, this can't be good. This cannot be good for me to be cooking with anymore. So now we've switched that out for either like cast iron or, a Dutch oven, like
Ceramic
enameled
or
cast iron. Yeah.
or stainless steel, that's really good too to have on there. But yeah, and hopefully you didn't like donate it to Goodwill or ARC or anything like that. Hopefully you threw those pans away because, or something, I don't know if I don't really know if you can repurpose it, I guess, but just make it so it's not reused. Like, we don't want those things coming back out there, because those that PFAS or PFOS, those types of chemicals, those octanoic acids, they will that's a part of those nonstick pans and flame retardants, and that's leaching into our water supply, which we have no regulated levels on what's acceptable in that. Again, so it's always about, do we know that this toxin even exists, and do we even know it's getting into us? Well, if it's never being tested, then how do we even know? So
Yeah,
hopefully you
that's
just threw it
really
away.
that's so scary. I I threw some of it away, but the rest that I have, I should really just throw away. It's seriously a constant battle in my mind between like, what do I absolutely refuse to throw away and try to repurpose as much as possible, and then what really is just trash and it does no good by being, here. So,
Yeah, exactly.
um, but then again, it's also, you think about, where is away? If I throw something away, it still exists somewhere. It's not like they're just magically gone or gonna decompose anytime soon. But not being utilized by other people is definitely very important to consider.
Yeah. Have you ever, when's the last time you've been to the dump?
Oh gosh, physically, it was a while ago, probably 10 years ago, but I feel like I'm surrounded by images of
It hasn't
dumps
changed,
all the
right?
time. Yeah.
But I mean, for your listeners, if they've never been to a dump, truly, where you have to take something there and you look at the trash, you look at the waste. We took down a shed recently, and we took it to the dump, and it's mostly just wood anyway, so I know it will compost. But the person next to me, literally, the entire semi truck was nothing but styrofoam that was just going to the dump. And you just look at it and you look at the waste that's being done, from either new items to used items, things that aren't being repurposed at all. It is just, if you've never been, I almost feel like it should be a field trip for kids or even high schoolers to have an understanding, because no one realizes it, right? You just put it in your bin outside your house and you bring it to the street and voila, it's gone. But it's a whole different world, and we don't burn our trash here. And there's times in Africa that when I was there, they're incinerating their trash. That's only, again, burning plastic. Geez, that's just a chemical nightmare. So
I know. Yeah, I totally think that should be like a required field trip for everybody. I think that, and then going to an actual, recycling processing plant as well, or looking at your, city water. Oh my gosh, what is the word for that, that place? The
the water purification plant, or what do you?
Yeah. So you can actually like learn more about that process within your own city. I think all of these things, if your city composts, then I think it would be amazing to also visit that. But unfortunately, that's not available to everybody yet. I'm going to believe and be hopeful that it will be,
Yeah,
becoming part of
composting.
the system.
Exactly. I mean, that's definitely part of it. Easy there too. And this may be a controversial question, but I want to ask it because I recently read California. They passed this compost mandate in these next couple of years where everybody will be composting there, so they don't have it. So they don't have this food waste going to the landfills and releasing all this methane, right? Because methane is a big component when you're talking about climate change. But now we're just mandating it at home to compost, but isn't it still releasing that methane? Like it's just in smaller levels, or like I don't understand those differences. And if you don't have an answer, trust me, it's okay. But
Yeah. Well, I need to look into what specific law this is or policy that you're talking about within California, because I haven't heard of that yet. But I know that it really depends on how that compost is being dealt with. And I think that there needs, if that is being passed, that it's like mandated across all of California, then there needs to be some major education that goes with it, because it's, if you were to just dump a bunch of food in your backyard or your patio, if you don't have a backyard, and you're just letting it sit and you're not quite sure how to take on composting, then yeah, that's definitely not any better than just like rotting in another landfill. But if there is being education, hopefully provided to citizens about how to do this, and if it's being composted properly, it can all decompose so that it is actually going back into the soil. And then the methane is then trapped beneath the soil. It's not rising up into the atmosphere. So that would be the biggest difference there, I think.
Good point. And by the way, listeners, I'm not from California. I'm a native of Colorado. So I may bring that up because I look at policies and is traveling. So
I am a native from California, and I lived back and forth between California and Colorado twice in each state. So it's funny just going back and forth. And, I think we give each other a lot of crap, going like Californians will say things about Coloradans and vice versa. And man, the most recent time I moved there, the biggest question that I got all the time, which I thought was so funny coming from Denver, but I got asked if I had cows and horses growing up. And I was definitely not raised on like a ranch or something like that. So it was a really funny question to me.
Wow, that's funny.
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, man. Well, this has been a really fun, if I can use that word, and educational conversation. I think a lot of what we're talking about is also really quite scary, but thinking about what we can control, bringing it back to that helps. And then thinking about what we can share with others in conversation, and just promoting education around all of these choices to benefit our health, I think is super important. Really, for me, it boils down to taking care of the climate is taking care of humanity, because all of these things are so interconnected. So I think I'm going to go into my final question for you. I have a routine final question that I bring into every episode, no matter who I'm talking to. And it's always just interesting to hear their responses based on their different backgrounds or levels of expertise. So, considering the various levels of privilege and accessibility and backgrounds of our listeners, if you could think through your top 1 or 2 or 3 actionable steps that listeners could take to benefit both their own health and the planet, what would you share with us?
So I guess 2 things. So easy on the first one would be, if you have that, right, test your water or have an understanding about where your water is coming from, and don't waste it. Freshwater supplies are down everywhere. It's such a concern. And when you pay your water bill, we should have to pay, when we verify a picture of what Lake Powell looks like, or what some of these reservoirs, because they're just so down. And then so testing your water, understanding these chemicals are really important, because that, again, 70% of your body is water, and you want that to be clean and pure. So that's one thing. The other thing is have a garden. Everybody can have a garden, whether or not you live in an apartment and you have a couple plants on your patio. One, you have an understanding of where food comes from. You're putting your hands in the soil and in the dirt, which is very helpful from the microbiome and just microbial activity, right? I mean, if you're playing in dirt a little bit more, it's better for your immune system. You're going to eat better. You're going to be able to control whether or not you have the pesticides or the herbicides on there, which, there's many other ways doing it, and, potting or anything like that, and pulling and picking the weeds, right? You'll get the exercise in that too. And it's cheap, right? I mean, you can save some money. Clearly, if you're going to plant a watermelon, that might be a little bit tougher when you look at the amount of work that goes into that and what you get out of it. You're like, geez, this was months of this and a lot of water, and this is what I got out of it, right? If you're not, you'll have to be good at it. But even having an herb garden, right now it's wintertime, you can easily have some herbs in your window that you can utilize to help put fresh herbs on a meal that you have prepared. So I think having a garden is just such a simple way. And then, of course, you're not I mean, going into monocropping, right? We have to feed 7 billion people in the world. That's just going to help. But having more plants out there too are going to reduce CO2, is going to help in that carbon fixation also.
Could you share, in case listeners don't know what monocropping is, just like a brief definition?
So if you've driven through Kansas or Iowa or anything like that, right, you just see where they're just kind of planting one thing. So it might be corn. Now they may be rotating the crops, since we've learned that since the Dust Bowl, right? You can't just keep planting the same crop over and over again, but it's going to be corn, it's going to be soy, it'll be milo, wheat, where these farmers get very good and very efficient at planting one or two crops, and they're just rotating that. Well, those one or two crops, one, reduces the mineral content in there, and then they may be spraying it with a chemical too. So now we're reducing potential bacteria diversity in those soils also. So monocropping, one cropping, that's it.
Thanks. Awesome. Yeah, I love the suggestion too of having a garden no matter where you live. Like, you can have this in your windowsill, you could have it on a balcony, but then you can also do this for free a lot of the time too. I mean, like, often we don't think about it, but if you've got a bell pepper, for example, and you just cut it open and we just toss those seeds, like, you could save those. You could, start growing a bell pepper and see if it'll take, if you can
Yeah.
manage that whole planting process.
Yep. Yeah. Sometimes a little bit tougher too, but when you think about the cost of an organic bell pepper, which is way better what you want to purchase, right? When you're talking about just pesticides on these, on the produce, I mean, that's $2 or $3, right? I mean, you can grow a couple of them also, and it's not like it's that much work, especially when you get it going. I don't think having a garden is really that much work when you get things moving.
Yeah, at least in my experience, it's really trial and error, and you have to be prepared and okay to know that it might not go so well the first time, or even the first 5 times. You might have to have a lot of dead plants before you get to a really good thriving one. But I finally just figured out how to keep my house plants alive. So I'm going to count that as a win.
And it doesn't actually even have to be a vegetable garden or a fruit garden or anything like that. You could just have a flower garden, because then what are the flowers going to do? They're going to help support these pollinators so everyone else can do it. We know pollination is super concerning when you think about the bee populations too. So it could just be a flower garden. It doesn't have to be anything, but it could be something like that you can actually grow and be a part of. And, there's community gardens around too. So you get to know your neighbor if you choose to do a community garden in some of those apartment areas that will have that too.
Absolutely. I love these suggestions, and just talking with you is so helpful. I feel like you are a wealth of knowledge and examples. And so I really appreciate you taking time to just share that with us today. And hopefully all of our listeners can feel, more motivated and inspired to take care of their own bodies and the global health and well-being of the planet than, being scared and filled with anxiety most of the time when you hear on the news about the different health crises and climate change crises that we're facing. But I think that we can all do something about it.
Yeah, I just have one last thing too, because sometimes when you think about all the toxins, it can be all about doom and gloom and, oh my gosh, what's the point? The reality is you really just need to trust your body. It is detoxifying all the time. So trust your body, just know that you're here, you were born, right? And now, and you're doing what your body can do, but it gets back to, are you living a healthy person? And not everything is doom and gloom.
Absolutely. That's so great. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course.